All right, so the Americas pre-Columbian empires to colonies. Part two, going to look at the Aztecs and the Incas, and some of the gods that you'll see on here. This is Tolok, and you can tell he's got the blue mask and the blue circle around the eyes. So this would be the rain god. This is Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, and then one of the other neat ones. I don't know exact name, but this guy wears the skin of his enemies actually on over him. That's why you see the two hands here. So that's actually somebody's skin that he's putting over his arm with a hand hanging down. All right, so the Aztecs, they lived in the Valley of Mexico, and this is in the center of Mexico. And what you have is you have this eye elevation, and so you have these mountains that go up, and then up on top of that is this Valley of Mexico, and it has a very temperate climate, which means it stays around 70 degrees year round, or used to. And its location is actually really good for growing crops. The Aztecs, or Mexia, were an alliance of several different groups of people who really just kind of got bullied by all the other tribes at the time. And what they ended up doing is they kind of banded together to protect themselves. Around 1300, they settled on an island in the center of the Valley of Mexico. So what you had was, here's the Valley of Mexico here, surrounded by mountains, and you ended up with this island kind of out in this lagoon area. So they learned to grow corn from their neighbors. In order to survive, they grew crops in what were called floating gardens. So this is in a wet, marshy land that they have in. They're almost living in swamps. So they actually had to make their own what really would be crops. And they made them in several different ways, and I'll show you a picture of kind of how they made it. So they made careful observation of the sky and aligned their temples based on the movements of the sun and the moon. And over the next 2 centuries, the Aztecs engaged in frequent wars to conquer the other people in the region. These conflicts continued until the arrival of the first Europeans when Cortez showed up. And here are their floating gardens. So you live in the swampy areas, water everywhere. And what they would do is they would just get these wooden, really it's like tree trunks almost, and fill it in with dirt in the middle. And then you could actually grow crops in areas that had swampy area or really too much water. And this is kind of what the Spanish saw when they came in. So this is why you call it a floating garden, because you can actually see them kind of with a bottom there, and then they're going to put dirt on top, and then they're going to grow. So here would be the island that they started with, and then this all becomes Mexico City. So here's all the floating garden crops and everything else, and then the mountains on the outside, and then the Valley of Mexico right here. And it's still done in certain places today. I think this is in Iraq right here. This is a good picture of it right here, them filling in that area so that they can farm. And then that is a good example of how far they kind of grew out. So this is the original island here. This is the main temple and complex, and then they just keep filling in. So Mexico City is this whole area right here that's been filled in over time by the different people who have lived there. So the Aztec developed a highly complex social organization. So the way they set up their classes, at the top of the Aztec society was the all-powerful emperor, of course. Below the ruler were the nobles, so the wealthy landowners who often held high positions in the government, also were the leaders in the army and in the priesthood. Most of these people were most of the other people were commoners, just like we talked about with the Mayan, working as farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, warriors, and in the Aztec armies. At the bottom of the society were slaves, which they had captured slaves. So Aztecs worshiped many different gods, so they're polytheistic. The most important was the sun god. Their observation of the sky made it possible to construct accurate calendars of stone. So the Aztecs believed the sun god needed blood to continue his daily journey across the sky. For this reason, the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice on a massive scale. So captured warriors from other tribes were sacrificed, as well as Aztecs who would actually volunteer to be sacrificed. They believed that their sacrifice was necessary to keep the universe in motion. And here's some pictures of what the Spanish drew when they got there. And here's one of the Aztec gods again. This is probably the plumed serpent, Quetzalcoatl. Here's the sun god, and then this is one of the priests taking the beating heart out. Some more pictures, and what they used was this is the sacrificial knife that they would use. And again, this is what the Spanish saw when they came. They were kind of freaked out by the whole thing. Here is their kind of hieroglyphics over here. So they're writing, very similar to the Egyptians. And then here's all their different gods over here on the left. Here's the Aztec weapons, and this was actually volcanic glass, and this supposedly you could actually chop a horse's head off completely with one of these here. But this is kind of their favorite weapon right here. And then there's their calendar. And the earth would be destroyed 4 times. That's why you see these 4 squares in here. All right, so the Inca, thousands of miles to the south of Mexico, an advanced culture developed along the Pacific coast and in the Andes Mountains of South America. People in the Andes terrace mountains and grew potatoes and other root crops that could resist the cold. So root crops is something that grows under the ground. So it didn't have to have a lot of heat, and it was actually protected from the really cold areas in the mountains. So that's really they're going to be their main crops, potatoes and root crops. So they kept llamas and alpacas, not only for their meat and wool, but they also used them for pretty much everything that they did carrying. They didn't have the wheel. So around 1400s, the Inca began to extend their rule across the Andes. Eventually, the Inca ruled an empire covering much of present-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile. The Inca built stone roads stretching over 10,000 miles to unite the distant, should be corners of the empire. Food was preserved and kept in these storage houses along the road. So they kind of what we talked about with the Romans and everybody else. They had these places where you could stop, rest, get food, and then keep going. But they're running most of the time. So their messages are sent by actually people running long distances. The Inca never developed carts with wheels, possibly because the vehicles were unsuited for the rugged terrain of the Andes Mountains. The Inca also never developed a form of writing. So one of the few that didn't. Instead, they had what was called a quipu, and this is a bundle of knots and colored rope to keep count, to keep records, and to send messages. So this right here was kind of like their writing, almost like a Morse code is what it ended up being. And this is I would probably say this is an alpaca, and then you can see the amazing stone buildings that they built. Oops, let me go back. Okay, so you can see how precise they got with their stones. And again, there's no tools or anything like to cut these with. So, and supposedly you can't even fit a knife blade in between these areas here. And they're put together. There's no concrete or anything like that. They're actually put together like a puzzle. So the superb engineering skills allowed them to construct vast stone buildings high in the Andes. They had no cement, but fitted their stones of their buildings perfectly together, like a puzzle. And you can see how close they got with these stones. The ruins of Machu Picchu, which you see here in these 2 pictures, it was an ancient fortress city in the Andes Mountains, provided the best surviving example of how well they could actually build things. A lot of other things were destroyed by the Spanish. Many of the building blocks were weighed 50 tons and are so precisely fitted together that the joints do not let a thin knife blade be inserted in between those joints. Here's some of their pre-Columbian art. So pre-Columbian art was highly developed. Maya, Aztec, and Inca artists made stone sculptures to decorate the sides of their temples and palaces. And they also had ceramic bowls with carved human and animal forms across the front for their religious ceremonies. Often these were used to ward off demonic spirits that they believed to be lurking in the afterlife. And then the gender roles in Mesoamerica. So this would be for really all 3 of the civilizations we've talked about. Gender roles were established at birth. Boys were given a machete, which is it's a knife, and we use it today to cut down weeds and things like that. So they're given a machete by their fathers to establish their masculine role. That's to show that the boy is in charge. Girls receive the stone instrument from their mothers, who was actually used to grind corn. Boys were taught crafts. Girls were taught how to cook and other necessities. And women held various roles in the family, from harvesting grain and preparing food to caring for animals. Aside from childbearing and raising animals, one of the women's major jobs was making the corn into flour. And after it was boiled, the corn kernels were then ground into stone and made into dough. Women could hold jobs outside the home. Some sold goods in the market. Others were skilled artisans, so they actually made things to sell. And others were actually priestesses who worked in the temples. And here's some of the Spanish paintings of it. It's pretty neat. And you can see the tortillas. So you can see the different things that they would do. And you see this is them speaking in their native language. All right, and then the Columbian Exchange. The writings of Marco Polo had increased European interest in trade with Asia. So Europeans are trying to find a way to Asia, and they don't think the Americas are there, so they're just going to be able to sail straight over to Asia. Goods, especially spices and silks, were carried overland to Constantinople and then shipped across the Mediterranean to the Italian city-states, like we talked about in the Middle Ages. So the conquest of the Byzantine Empire by the Ottoman Turks, so the Muslims take over the Byzantine Empire, cuts the trade off. So they have to find another way to get to Asia. As a result, incentives were created to find new routes to the east, especially by an all-water passage. So at the same time, the spirit and query of the Renaissance was leading Europeans to explore the oceans. So these two things mixed. They had to find a way to get to the east for the silks and spices, and then you had the Renaissance that were telling people to go out and explore. So Europeans adopted technological innovations from other cultures to improve their navigation skills, including the compass from China and the triangular sail used by Arab ships. So they get the compass from China, and then they copy the Arab sails. So these two things make a big difference when they're getting ready to take off and make these voyages.